Well, good afternoon. Are you ready for some more apologetics?
Yes.
All right. Well, let's do a summary of what we talked about yesterday. Today's our third and final day of dealing with apologetics. I want to give you a summary of what we talked about yesterday by way of refresher. So remember, we started with evidence for a creator in cosmology. That's the big picture. That's the universe. And we finished that off. But we finished it off by talking about what I refer to as desperation theories by people who are naturalists and atheists, desperately coming up with or attempting to come up with the ABG, anything but God scenario. And so one of those was the multiverse. Remember, there was this universe generating machine that apparently occurred to generate billions of universes, and finally it got one just right. Anyway, you can safely put that in the ash bin of history as far as theories are concerned. And then we gave a summary of 8 areas where cosmology confirms the scriptures. So that finished off cosmology. And then we moved next to evidence for a creator in astronomy. So we're moving from the biggest picture to a big picture, but not as large, and we're moving down. So evidence for a creator in astronomy. We talked about the approach of naturalism to the Earth, the Sun, the solar system, the Milky Way galaxy. And naturalists have what they call a principle of mediocrity, saying that all of those things, the Earth, the Sun, the solar system, and the Milky Way, are just nondescript, run-of-the-mill, not particularly significant entities in our universe. We found out that it is actually not the principle of mediocrity, it's a mediocre principle, because the best evidence today suggests and shows clearly that our Earth is a privileged, rare Earth. That's not my words, that's the words of 2 prominent astronomers who aren't believers. Our sun is a very specific and special sun. And the relationship between our Earth and the sun is a particularly special, unique one. Our solar system is also a unique one. We talked about the Milky Way galaxy, which is not just a run-of-the-mill galaxy, but one of the largest in the whole solar system, in the whole universe. So we talked about that area, and it came down to a different principle. Remember the principle? It was the Goldilocks principle, described also by scientists, completely contrary to the principle of mediocrity, saying that everything that's related to our Earth, including the moon, the sun, the solar system, the Milky Way galaxy, is just right to enable life to exist on Earth. That's the Goldilocks principle. We looked at the age of the heavenly bodies, the solar system and the stars, and found that there is excellent evidence to see those bodies as being young in origin, and certainly to contradict and refute the standard ages that are given for the sun being 10 billion years old and other parts of the universe being 4.5 billion years old. There's evidence that contradicts that directly. Then we move to the evidence for a creator in physics. And we talked about the constants in physics. We said that there are over 30 of them. These are things that are specific powers or forces that do not change. And we found that they are all related to what's called the fine-tuning of the universe, that it has been finely tuned so specifically that it could not have been done by chance. And we gave the examples of the gravitational constant and the cosmological constant, but there's 30 of them. And they're all so finely tuned that every one of them has to be exactly tuned or the universe can't exist. We then went to the evidence for a creator in geology. And we talked about 2 approaches to geological forces in the Earth. The approach of the approach of catastrophism and gradualism. And gradualism is that theory that says, hey, it's just been a long, slow process for billions of years that's made the changes on the Earth. There haven't been any substantial, catastrophic changes that have shaped things. We showed that the best evidence in science that there clearly has been catastrophic changes, and those catastrophic changes include the worldwide flood. Huge evidence for the worldwide flood that is in the geological rock formation. And specifically, we talked about the Grand Canyon, and we talked about the sedimentary rock that's not only in the Grand Canyon, but in all the continents of the world, wherever you go. These layers of sedimentary rock that are only created by the precipitation of different kinds of materials carried by water. And then these materials harden and form these sedimentary rocks. Clear evidence for a worldwide flood. We talked about how fossils are made, that fossils are made through a catastrophic process, not through long billions of years. And that the evidence is that it's in these sedimentary rock layers that you find the fossils. That's because they were part of the destruction that occurred during the time of the flood, and then they were preserved by this rapid catastrophic process that squeezed out the oxygen, which otherwise would cause decay of them, and they never would be fossils. We talked about the flood stories that are in different cultures around the world, cultures that haven't had, at the time those stories came out, any contact with Europeans, any contact with Christians, any awareness of the Old and New Testament. But before they ever had that contact, they had flood stories that are remarkably exact towards what we see in the book of Genesis. Isn't that good? We talked about the age of the earth and the age of the Grand Canyon. And we showed evidence for different structures on earth that actually have been formed very rapidly in ways that leave structures that naturalists would say, well, this had to take millions, billions even, of years to form. Mount St. Helens was one example. Structures formed in 20 years that naturalists would say would take millions of years to form. Providence Canyon in Georgia, the same kind of thing, a deep, deep cavern formed in a canyon formed in 100 years. We talked about the Carlsbad Caverns and the stalagmites and stalactites, and how they had to keep changing the dates on the Carlsbad Caverns down to the point where today they've taken the sign off. They don't even tell you what they think the date is because they've been wrong so many times before. And finally, we talked about how the Earth's magnetic field has been weakening and weakening so that it's estimated that within 1,000 years it'll be gone. But naturalists say the Earth's magnetic field has been around for billions of years and will continue to last. And finally, we talked about radiometric dating, things like carbon dating and other methods, potassium argon. How these methods that supposedly are the clinchers to tell us how old the rock on the Earth is are not clinchers at all, because they've been found to be wrong over and over and over again. And not only that, but they are in opposition to what's called non-radiometric techniques for dating rocks that show rock to be only in the thousands of years old. So this is kind of the area that we talked about yesterday. And remember, in that radiometric dating, we talked about the fact that there were rocks from Mount St. Helens, lava rock formed in 20 years that were tested through radiometric dating and found to be 1.3 to 3 million years old. They were only out by 1.3 million less 20 years. So we've moved down the process from cosmology to astronomy to physics. Finally, we came to the rock we call planet Earth and geology. And now we're coming to us, you and me. We've moved from the inorganic, which is non-life, to life itself. So today we're going to talk about origins of life and the evidence of microbiology. And if time permits, we're going to look at a very special word for day, the word yom, in the Hebrew language. So starting off, turn, if you would, to page 40 in your syllabus. And here's some scriptures that talk about not only creation, but the wisdom of God and the foolishness of man. Psalm 14:1, listen to this. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. There were fools thousands of years ago when David wrote that, saying there is no God. They are corrupt. They have done abominable works. There's none who does good. 2 Peter 3, 3-7. See if you notice something in this relating to what we talked about yesterday as I read this. Peter says, knowing this first, that scoffers will come in the last days, walking according to their own lusts, and saying, where's the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, that's years and years ago, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. What does that sound like? You see, that is Peter 2,000 years ago writing about gradualism. Even in those days, over 2,000 years ago, there were people who were saying, no, everything's just going along at a slow pace, just as it was since everything was started. There's no catastrophic changes that have been happening. It's just long, slow process. Well, they didn't use the term evolution back then. They were using the same concepts of gradualism, long, slow time periods. Let's look at the rest of these verses. After saying that, then Peter says to these people with the idea of gradualism, for this they willfully forget that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of water and in the water, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water. And then he goes on to say, but the heavens and the earth, which are now preserved by the same word, are reserved for fire until the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men. What does that sound like? The first part of this verse talked about people who believe in gradualism. Peter has to remind them that there have been catastrophic events on earth that caused these significant changes. He had to remind them even 2,000 years ago, there has been a catastrophic flood. You're willfully forgetting that that's the case. And the whole earth system, the world then perished, flooded with water. And then he reminds them and tells them that there's going to be a different kind of catastrophic event that will be coming in the future. Interesting, isn't it, that there's nothing new under the sun. So 2 Peter chapter 3, and I'm just going to read you verse 8 as a bonus verse. Peter finishes, but beloved, do not forget this one thing, that with the Lord 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as 1 day. That's telling us two things. One is that God is timeless. Remember, we talked about the Creator being timeless. But it's also telling us something else. And that is that these processes that people think take thousands of years or longer than that can happen in a day. Think of Mount St. Helens. Think of Mount St. Helens. And then I'm not going to read you these scriptures, but when we go into origins of life and the evidence of microbiology, remember that we go back to the scriptures to tell us how life came to be. We go back to the first chapter of Genesis that said, in the beginning, God. And after he created all the physical structures, then he began to create life. The scriptures in Genesis clearly show that it was God who made life, not an accidental, random process like evolution. And we are the product of his creation as well. So then, with that introduction, how did life begin? Let's look at the worldviews again, because it's always going back to the worldviews. The biblical account, which I just talked to you about. In the beginning, God created. John 1, 1 through 3. In the beginning was the Word. There was a beginning. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And it goes on to say that through him, nothing has been made that has not been made by him. But what's the naturalist approach to the area of life? It's the same approach that they have with respect to the cosmos and cosmic evolution. They say that we are here and all life is here only because of natural material causes. And of course, now they come out with their theory and philosophy as to how this happened. And of course, that's the theory of evolution. Let me read to you, you'll see this on page 41 in your materials, an example of a naturalist scientist and the viewpoint that is held by folks with this kind of philosophy. Let me summarize my views on what modern evolutionary biology tells us loud and clear. There are no gods, no purposes, no goal-directed forces of any kind. There is no life after death. When I die, I'm absolutely certain that I'm going to be dead. Boy, if it was only the case for this poor guy. That's the end for me. There is no ultimate foundation for ethics, no ultimate meaning to life, and no free will for humans either. Say, I sure want to join his club. Sign me up tomorrow. This comes from William Provine, professor of biological sciences and utter foolishness at Cornell University. And you see, here's where this kind of thinking leads us. Because remember, he is saying there is no ethics. There is a professor of ethics, Peter Singer, at Yale University. And Peter Singer advocates this. This is not an exaggeration, that parents should be entitled to euthanize their children up to 2 years of age because they are not fully human up to 2 years of age. Now, this is not an exaggeration. He has written on this. He is a professor of ethics. This is where this viewpoint leads us to. The astonishing thing is that he is still a professor of ethics at Yale University. How can this be? How can this be? He also has advocated that if you are doing experiments scientifically, if you have a choice between a disabled human and a chimpanzee, you would always do the experiments on disabled human beings. This is what he has advocated and written about. Look him up. I'm not exaggerating. So let's look now at the viewpoint. We've looked at the biblical viewpoint and the truths in the scriptures. We've talked about the naturalist approach. And now let's look at intelligent design and creationism, which clearly and simply says there is evidence of intelligent design in the universe. That evidence points to a creator who is a personal creator. Now, something as we go into this that I want to just emphasize that really is important when we deal with the term science. Sometimes we have a misconception here. There are two different kinds of science. One is called experimental and the other is called forensic. In experimental science, someone comes up with a theory and they test that theory against repeated observations of present events. I'll tell you what I mean by that. Somebody comes up with the idea, I think if I take 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom and put them together, it'll make something called water. So they propose that, they do an experiment, and lo and behold, they have this fluid, and they say it's water. But what the scientific approach in the experimental area says is, okay, that's a start, but we got to test this again and again. It's got to be repeatedly tested so it's not just some event that happened by some accident. And so others test that again and again. 2 atoms of hydrogen, 1 atom of oxygen, Bob's your uncle, whether he is or not, and you get water again. So it's repeatedly testable. That is experimental science. But forensic science is something very different. A theory is developed about past unobserved events which are historical and not repeatable, such as the creation of the universe. No one was there but God. We're not going to have a repeat of this same process until we get a new heaven and a new earth. You don't want to kind of wait along till then to, get your understanding straight about who made this one. So in forensic science, you develop this theory about these past unobserved events. Here's an example. In detective work, they continually do that. It's forensic science. Nobody was there at the crime scene. That's it, crime scene. So what they have to do is go back. They develop a theory as to how it's happened. They develop clues, and they present their theory as to who done it. That is forensic science. But nobody, in most instances, was there at the scene of the crime. And that's origins of life. That's forensic science. So when people tell you that, well, this is science that we are dealing with, it's a different kind of science than experimental science. There is, from the scientific standpoint, no absolute proof of creationism, intelligent design on the one hand, or evolution on the other. I can tell you that there will be no absolute proof of that until we're in heaven. But what we can do is to amass the evidence that we have and come forward with the most plausible explanation. That's what we do with forensic science. What's happening is, it is people with a different interpretation of the same facts. So, a prosecution lawyer and a defense lawyer may look at the same series of facts with respect to an alleged crime. And they will come forward with different theories as to what happened, but using the same set of facts. Okay? That's what's happening in this whole area of, particularly as we're talking about it today, evolution and evolutionary theory. So evolutionary theory is based on assumptions, not absolute evidence, about this unobserved past. Let me read you a quote here that is interesting in relation to this issue. And this is a fellow who, in a sense, was being, I'm going to say, ignorantly candid. He is a geneticist, a leading promoter of evolution. His name is Richard Lewontin. And he shows us what the mindset is of people who are coming with certain assumptions that evolution is accurate and there's no God. He says this: we take the side of science in spite of, listen to this, in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just so stories. He's actually being pretty candid here. Because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism, which is the other word for naturalism. Everything only occurs from natural causes. He's actually being candid enough to say, I'm going to tell you our assumptions. Unapologetically, we have a prior commitment to materialism, no matter how absurd some of the science that comes out to try and prove it shows to be. It's not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world. Wow. But on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori, that means independent of experience, adherence to material causes. We've decided in advance what we're sticking with, and we're sticking with it come heck or high water. We are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, listen to this, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, and here's the clincher, moreover, that materialism is an absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. What do you think of them apples? Rotten apples. Let me give you a summary of Darwinism on Darwinism's own terms, because we have to test Darwinism accurately against what it says. Here's what it says. Number one, all life comes from natural causes on the basis of chance. Next, they say that here's how it happened. Inorganic molecules, that is, molecules that are not living substance, somehow formed organic molecules, which is living matter. And how? Spontaneously. When you ask them how that occurred, they don't know, but they know it happened. Doesn't sound very scientific. Third, organic molecules caused a primitive, here's a typo, should be simple cell. Caused an initial primitive simple cell. And then number 4, the primitive cell evolved to complex life. How? Through mutation. We'll talk about mutation later. And time and natural selection. We'll talk about that later. And through, to summarize it, the Holy Trinity of matter, time, and chance. What they say is that with this primitive cell, there were many small changes, billions and billions and billions of them, that created this evolutionary process. So that finally, through this process of mutation, time, and natural selection, it came to you and me. Here's the little cutesy phrase that are used by materialists: from the goo to the zoo to you. The goo is that original concoction of inorganic soup that somehow changed into life. So these are many small changes. And this happened so that as a result, we are all from an original common ancestor. And here's the important thing that we need to, of course, test evolutionary theory against is nature, it says, does not make leaps. There's no sudden changes. It's all small, incremental changes over billions of years. We're going to test them on this in a little while. Here's the interesting thing about mutation, though. They rely on mutation as the key through this process. Mutation is not a positive facilitative change. Mutations are mistakes that have happened in the genetic code. They are random errors in the genetic structures of organisms that are passed on to their offspring. And they give examples of things like atmospheric radiation and so forth cause these problems. Consider that and keep that in your mind. Think mutation, think random mistakes in the genetic code. Then natural selection comes in. And here's the interesting thing. Mr. Natural Selection, because we want to be respectful to him, so we'll call him Mr. Natural Selection, has become personified as though there was some kind of a personalized force. When you read about what is said about natural selection, you would think that this is almost some kind of a spiritual, godlike sort of character, some non-material essence. There is nothing where we can look in the natural world and say, there it is, you know, we have through our atomic microscopes now found natural selection. It's just a force of some sort that's thrown out there as though it's personified. And here's what natural selection is said to do. It favors positive changes in this process of random mutation and discards the negative changes or the neutral changes. It says, this is the theory, that natural selection can only use working systems. So whenever there's a genetics, whenever there's this evolutionary change over billions of years, Mr. Natural Selection looks at it and says, does this work? Okay, you go ahead, you pass go, you collect $200. Does this work? You're out, you're in the garbage. So we now come from natural selection to the concept of survival of the fittest. The ones that aren't working systems get discarded. They're not fit. The ones that are working systems get promoted, go to the head of the class. So then what about this? Someone may say to you, well, what about, wait a minute, you're saying that evolution has really got this shaky foundation. What about interspecies changes? There are interspecies changes. Yeah, there are. For example, there are varieties within animals. Let's take the dogs. You can have a Great Dane, you got a dog. You can have a Chihuahua, you have a dog. No, I'm sorry, I got to retract that one. A Chihuahua is not a dog. But you know what I mean. You get the drift. You get the drift. There are varieties within different species. That is not Darwinian evolution. That is called microevolution. That is, within a species there are varieties, but they're all dogs. They're all horses. And none of them ever changes from being a dog to a horse to an elephant. They all generate their own kind. I heard that once before. Sounds to me like maybe it was a Genesis. They always say that kind of, if we want to, see, the word evolution actually just means change. But it's the way it's been used in Darwinianism that's the problem. Because there they're talking about macroevolution, from that primitive single cell, which forms eventually over billions of changes, something different, another species, another species. That's the concept in evolution. It is change between the species. So the conclusion of Darwinism, roughly put, is that there is this continual upward progress in evolution, fish to amphibians, to reptiles, to birds, to mammals, including us. Maybe the next stage is what? The X-Men? Well, in fact, the whole idea of the X-Men is actually built upon that concept. These random genetic changes develop these new, unique characteristics in certain people that start to begin to be manifested, and they're called mutants. That's why they're called that in the X-Men. Very entertaining series. I watch them. They're a lot of fun. They are just completely scientifically bunk, but very entertaining. How does the theory of evolution stack up against the evidence? Folks, when we go through this, what I want you to do is really pay attention to these things, because these are areas that are going to help you when you're talking to other people. Let's look at the laws of thermodynamics. Remember, we said they are the most fundamental laws of science, never refuted. Everybody holds to them to be true. The law of entropy, that is, that everything is continually running down and deteriorating, is used all the time to test new scientific concepts. And if any of those scientific concepts that are proposed fail and go against the law of entropy, they are discarded. So let's test evolution against the law of entropy. Evolution says that there is a continual upward progression and improvement all the time in this process of change from species to species to species. We are just one of the processes. Give us 1 million years and there will be, life forms that you've never even dreamed about, because it's a continual upward progress. Entropy says exactly the opposite. There is a continual downward progression of decay and disorder. And the interesting thing is, when you look at the fossil record, we actually see that. It's not an upward progression, it's actually evidence of extinction and death. You're getting whole types of creatures that stopped and died. There wasn't an upward progress. We're going to talk about intermediates in a little while, and you're going to see that. How then, if we've got this law of entropy, do we have order in creation at all? Like, why doesn't it just fly off the handle and disintegrate? Well, we talked about that in physics, right? We said there are all these constants, and these constants are so finely tuned that if you change things by one tick in phenomenal billion number of ticks, everything stops. Well, we know how everything is despite the law of entropy, which, by the way, comes from the Garden of Eden. Remember, we talked about that. How does this place just not fall apart? Is because there's one who is upholding all things by the word of his power. And that is an offset to the effects of the curse. In fact, for us, if any man is in Christ, he becomes a new creature. It's through that process of the spiritual, the upholding of all things by him, that new process of becoming a new creature can go against the grain of entropy. Do I hear an amen? Amen. Amen. So, let's look at it this way. Evolution says that there is this deep time of billions of years. Deep time is fatal to evolution. Why? Because the more time you give entropy to cause things to run down, the more they disintegrate. If you have billions of years available for entropy to work, entropy is going to disintegrate more and more and more and more things. Not so to the same extent in a young Earth. Here's the final truth of this, is that all life and non-life obeys the laws of thermodynamics. How does it stack up, the theory of evolution, against this fundamental law of science? It fails completely. And we've just got started. So what about the fossil record? Let's look at the fossil record. Darwin himself, let's take him at his own words and his own test. He said, with respect to the evolutionary theory, his theory, if one part falls, they all fall. I can tell you that they have been falling left and right. His theory requires many, and here's the word I told you about, intermediates between species. Because in that process of starting out from the initial primitive, simple, single-celled creature, there has to be, by their own words, not by my twisting their theory, there has to be a change from that one into the next form, into the next form, and there will have to be a multiple millions of series of intermediates in the fossil record that eventually get us up to ourselves. And Darwin was confident that there would be, but here's the interesting thing. There were fossil excavations taking place at the time of Darwin's lifetime, and Darwin confessed that he was disturbed by the fossil record because it had not shown any evidence of those intermediates. But he took heart, and he said, but when they really begin to in earnest do fossil excavation years from now, these intermediates will show up in the thousands, not the thousands alone, but the millions. So let me ask you this question. Since that time, because we have had huge fossil excavation around the globe since that time, let me ask you this. How many intermediates do you think they have found? Zero. Darwin's own words now completely repudiate his theory, and we've just got started. In fact, no intermediate forms, and fossils, when you look at the fossil record, they show little or no change during their history. And some of these fossils are things that were living in the past and actually have ancestors today that look, but if they do, they look just the same. Sometimes they may be a bit smaller, but hey, a Chihuahua is smaller than a Great Dane, right? So you might see some differences in sizes, but you see the same creatures that the ancestors exist, but others are extinct. Others are just dead end. They died, and they're done. But no intermediates. So here's an example of one of these fossils. As a kid, I was just big into paleontology, and you know, I was just super enthused and did fossil excavation and stuff like that. And there were what we call trilobites. And these trilobites were invertebrates. I don't know what you would sort of see them as kind of closest to, but they look like some kind of an invertebrate bug, but a large one. And they occurred in the early Cambrian period. So we say, well, you know, this is a creature we don't see around anymore, so obviously just a primitive thing. I guess we'll conclude that that's a primitive process of evolution. Actually, they found that the trilobites have had the most sophisticated eyes in all the animal kingdom, including ours. So this was not just a primitive creature with some primitive developments. Even some of these fossils give evidence of very sophisticated development. Here's another interesting thing as we test the fossil record. There's increasing evidence of soft tissue in fossils. I mentioned that yesterday. Soft tissue in fossils can only last for thousands of years, not millions. Let's move next to the Cambrian explosion. It's called biology's Big Bang. So Darwin says there can be no sudden changes. They have to be all small changes over vast time. Before the Cambrian period, there were very limited fossils. Jellyfish, sponges, worms, no gradual process, no intermediates. And then when they go into the fossil record at the beginning of the Cambrian period, which is where all this sedimentary rock is, almost all the phyla of every animal that has ever existed suddenly appear in the fossil record. Boom, fully formed. No intermediates. Suddenly they're all there. Some people say that every one of the phyla 40 types. These are the major animal types were there. And by the way, the Cambrian period ended with a mass extinction. Cambrian period is the same period that had all the sedimentary rock that is evidence of a global flood. Put that in your cap. No intermediates. So, what does that sound like? When all these animal types suddenly appear in the fossil record at the same time, fully formed. Well, there's something else it makes me think of. Sounds to me like creation. Because it was in creation that all the animal types suddenly appear. And the Cambrian record actually demonstrates that very thing. Darwin knew about the Cambrian period, and he said it was inexplicable to him. He found it baffling. It's important to note that Darwin's scientific colleagues rejected Darwinism on the basis of it being poor science, not showing evidence. Now remember, I talked to you about desperation science in physics and cosmology. There's desperation science in biology as well. And so one of the leading evolutionists in the world, Stephen Jay Gould, now passed away, puzzled about this whole process of no evidence in the fossil record, said, I know what it is. I'm coming up with a theory called punctuated equilibrium. Hey, that's pretty clear. We all know what punctuated equilibrium is. Well, here's what it is. He said the explanation for the lack of fossil record is that nature remains static for millions of years. Apparently, it kind of forgot about the evolutionary process for a while. There you go. It was static for millions of years, and then suddenly, as if it woke up and remembered, what the heck have I been doing? I'm supposed to be evolving. Suddenly, new mutations of creatures appeared so fast that no fossils were left. And you'd sort of say to yourself, is this guy brain dead? Well, he was a professor of biology at Harvard University for years. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about him as we go on in the next hour. Let's move next to the 4 sacred cows of Darwinism. But before we do it, I'm going to read you an excerpt of something and just say that the evolutionary theory fails the fossil test, just like it did fail the thermodynamics test. So let me read you something from a leading evolutionist. Dr. Douglas Fukuyama, one of the most well-known evolutionary biologists of the 20th century and a professor. And he finally said something quite honest and candid. Organisms either appeared on the earth fully developed, Cambrian says they did, or they did not. If they did not, they must have developed by pre-existing species from some process of modification. If they did appear in a fully developed state, they must indeed have been created by some omnipotent intelligence. The scripture, of course, gives that evidence, but the Cambrian period itself gives that evidence. Some of them, at least, are becoming a little more honest. Let's start into the 4 sacred cows of Darwinism. These are 4 things that were considered to be the best proofs of Darwinism and evolution. And every one of them was either completely wrong or even fraudulent. So let's start off with the Miller experiment in 1953. What they were saying is because everything started by evolutionary processes from the goo, that inorganic soup that became organic, what we can do is let's attempt to create organic chemicals. We'll do an experiment. So he came up with a concept of what he thought was the atmosphere of early Earth. Good on him. Apparently that was several billion years ago, so I'm not sure how he came up with it, but somehow he had the idea. So he put together a chemical soup. He shot electric sparks through it to create, and did create, some degree of amino acids. Apparently that's not too difficult to do. Think of it this way. If God created the elements on Earth, you may be able to fool with some of those chemicals and produce some form of organic chemicals. So the purpose was to prove that chance can create life. And for years, including when I went to University of Biology, the Miller experiment was held up as a real example of this. Well, in fact, the top scientists in the world have now come to a consensus that what he put out as the supposed atmosphere of early Earth wasn't even close. They now have a consensus of what they believe that early atmosphere was. And that early atmosphere, rather than being something that would have by chance been conducive to life, actually produces formaldehyde and cyanide that would actually be toxic to life. It's what's put into embalming fluid. But secular texts are still using it as though it was accurate. Secondly, Darwin's tree of life. Darwin did this sketch of a tree. It was this elegant thing showing this tree that was like the original ancestor was here, and then all these branches branched out into these kinds of animals, until you came to the apex, which is man. Darwin's tree of life. In fact, because of the evidence of the Cambrian period, biologists generally say that's utter nonsense. If it looks like anything, it looks more like a lawn than a tree, because all the animals were formed at the same time, not through this branching out process. So Darwin's tree of life, which he called it, was actually more of a tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the end. That was a pun, but I think it's accurate. So the Cambrian explosion just refutes Darwin's tree of life. Third, Haeckel's embryos. This was Darwin's strongest proof. He was really excited about this one. Ernst Haeckel was a 19th century biologist. And what he came up with was a theory that says embryos in their earliest stages of all organisms are nearly identical. Whether it's men, whether it's horses, whether it's salamanders, whether it's frogs, whatever it is, earliest stage of embryo, you look at them all, they look the same, and that proves we came from a common ancestor. Bob's your uncle. Well, what he did was he produced woodcuts. So these are images carved in wood showing what these embryos would look like, or sketches. And said, there it is. Here's 8 different embryos, or however many, and we'll show you the stages. Look at the first stage, they all look the same. It was found even in his lifetime that it had been fraudulent. What he did was he took one drawing, just reproduced it 8 times, or one woodcut and reproduced it 8 times, and said horse, man, dog, salamander. It was the same thing. Years later, including when I went to University of Biology, they were still holding up Haeckel's embryos as one of the big demonstrations of the evidence of evolution. Our man Stephen Jay Gould, who came up with this punctuated equilibrium, even was honest enough to say when he was confronted with this, he said, oh, we've known this for years and years and years that it was fraudulent. He said, it's really the equivalent of academic suicide. That was the biggest proof of the theory of evolution. Fourth, and I'll speak fast now because I got 1 minute left, the Archaeopteryx. I knew about that when I was a kid collecting fossils. It was found in 1861, and it was trumpeted as the missing link between, in this case, reptiles and birds. It was a fossil with wings and feathers and the wishbone of a bird, but a lizard-like tail and claws on its wings. There it is, the demonstration of the intermediate, the missing link. Proves the evolutionary theory. Later it was found by ornithological experts that it was, is that ever rude? Couldn't they have done Brahms' Lullaby? Was found to be a bird with modern feathers that's now extinct. These guys were the sacred cows. These were the strongest proofs. And now you can take a break. So remember, we've been talking about how evolution and that theory stacks up against the evidence. So let's go on page 45 to other missing links in dinosaur evolution. I put it in quotation marks because there have been no intermediates or missing links found. And these are more recent examples of where people have become excited about finding the missing link. So let's talk about the Archaeoraptor. It was a fossil purchased in the 1990s at a mineral show in Florida. And there it was, clearly the missing link, had a dinosaur tail and the forearms of a bird. This was the missing link between land dinosaurs and flying dinosaurs, says the National Geographic. And the National Geographic in its article went on to say, confidently, feathered dinosaurs are the ancestors of birds, in its 1999 article. I remember reading the article. It was actually found to have been a deliberate fraud by a Chinese paleontologist. Because at these mineral shows, you can sell these fossils for scads of money, especially if you got the missing link. He had glued a dinosaur tail to a primitive bird fossil for nothing other than filthy lucre, money. Let's go on to Bambiraptor. Hey, the 1990s was a good decade for this. Also in the 1990s at a Florida dinosaur conference. They found a chicken-sized dinosaur and the paleontologist said, this is the missing link. And then they did a reconstructed model, because they find the fossil, they did a reconstructed model showing feathers on them. The problem was, in the original fossil, there were actually no evidence of feathers at all. So they were asked, why did they put feathers on this fossil, on this reconstruction? The answer was, they thought they should be there. I'm not exaggerating. And what they did is on this reconstructed model, they put the artificial eyes that are used by taxidermists in eagles and other birds. So of course it looked just like a bird. Oh, let me tell you a little bit more about Bambiraptor, because this year, Sharon and I went to the Royal Ontario Museum exhibit, and we went along among the dinosaurs and we found a bird-like dinosaur, Bambiraptor, same one. There was the reconstructed Bambiraptor in all its feathered glory, and the statement underneath it was, birds are modern dinosaurs. Contrary to the evidence, but where did it come from? It came from this theory that supposedly was fulfilled in something that's now been discredited. Somebody should tell the Royal Ontario Museum. How about turkey DNA in dinosaur bones? In this same conference that Bambiraptor made its spectacular appearance, they got really excited because paleontologists found turkey DNA in dinosaur bones. A 65 million year old dinosaur bones, they told us. And so that proves the connection. But in fact, the best biologists and paleontologists in the world just laugh and they say, no, only modern turkeys have 100% turkey DNA. Nothing else that's ever existed has 100% turkey DNA except current turkeys. So, but that did not stop Science magazine, one of the big prestigious magazines, from publicizing this, that they'd found the turkey DNA in 65 million year old dinosaur bones. Was that proof? No, it wasn't. One of the leading biologists in the world says that was a contaminated sample. What do you mean a contaminated sample? He said, I'll give you a clear example. If the guy who was doing the experiment on this had had a turkey sandwich and then went and did work on this, that's where the DNA would have come from. He said, it is absolutely impossible for this to have been the case. Not according to Science magazine, though. You may want to change your subscription. How about famous missing links in human evolution? Let's start with Java Man, not a guy who drank a lot of coffee a long time ago. Also called Homo erectus. Are you familiar? Are you folks familiar? Any of you familiar with what they call the March of Progress, or the Parade of Human Evolution? You know, you've seen this famous picture where you start off with something that's a chimp-like creature, and he's on all fours, and then he gets a little more erect, kind of thing, because he's been to the chiropractor. And then the next stage after that, he's a little bit bigger, a little more erect, and you move along until finally you have modern man striding proudly at the beginning. Okay, So there we have the March of Progress. Java Man was included in that March of Progress. He came from an 1892 excavation, and he was trumpeted as a 500,000-year-old missing link. He is an intermediate, and he was a smaller brain type of non-human being. The only remains they had for him, and you'll find this over and over again in fossil excavation, is not a full skeleton, but they had a small piece of skull cap, 3 teeth, and a thigh bone. And there is how we can establish that this was a missing link. This got them so enthused that they made a full head bust of this out of a little skull cap and saying, this is what he would have looked like. They didn't even have a skull. And that bust is in the American Museum of Natural History to this day. Very prestigious, a museum. Later on, darn it, they found that the thigh bone was from a different fossil that wasn't like this at all, and they found that the skull was human. In 1992, listen to this, folks, a series of the top experts around the world, we're not talking Christians who are trying to push, creationism. They did a 342-page report by experts showing how this absolutely and clearly were human remains. It was not a missing link, and it had normal brain capacity. How many people do you think read that 342-page report? Zero. 1992, other than some scientists. 1992. 1994, 2 years after the report's written, Time magazine proudly shows Java Man on the cover of its magazine saying, the missing link. It's already been discredited by the most thorough scientific treatise. How many people do you think read that one? Lots of people. And now they know that Java Man's part of the missing link. In the 1998 edition of Darwin's Origin of Species, Java Man appears proudly on the cover in the Parade of Progress, still. In 2003, a book that I have at home, A Short History of Nearly Everything by Bill Bryson, I looked and I thought, how does Bill treat Java Man? Oh, he's still got Java Man proudly in there as of 2003. Apparently hasn't read the book or got the memo. I want to tell you something about things that really have become so bizarre in the, things that have been suggested as examples of different human, precursors and different types that are part of human evolution, is that they've actually come out with recently a new March of Progress slide. I'm going to show you how absolutely bizarre this is. Some of these most bizarre missing links have been put in this Parade of Progress. So we're going to show it to you on the screen here, and you'll see what I mean. In fact, you'll find that in these intermediates, there's one of these creatures that's been carrying something that has been colloquially called the Club of Grace. How bizarre does this get? Let's turn to Piltdown Man. Don't tell Andrew. Let's turn to Piltdown Man on page 47. Piltdown Man was a 1992 proposed missing link between apes and man. What they found was a skull, a jawbone, some teeth, and some primitive tools. Boy, how could you get more clear evidence than that? He had a human-like skull and a jawbone like a chimpanzee. He likewise was trumpeted by being 500,000 years old. And you can take off the March of Progress anytime. He was trumpeted to have been 500,000 years old because he fulfilled the theories and expectations that naturalists had. In 1953, 41 years later, it was found to be a fraud. Someone had altered an orangutan jawbone and teeth and fitted them into a human skull. But for 41 years, the scientific community was absolutely enraptured with excitement that they had found the missing link. Do you see how quickly they will latch onto something that fulfills their worldview and expectation without, significantly and thoroughly testing it even from a scientific standpoint? Had to wait for 41 years. How about Neanderthal man? If anybody's watched the the movie Encino Man, the guy that appears as the caveman type creature that's supposedly Neanderthal man. They previously were considered to be primitive cavemen. That was the term. In fact, new studies have found them actually to have been highly intelligent. A Christian orthodontist was asked to do an examination and assessment of some of the skeletal remains of Neanderthal man in Europe. They've got a number of these preserved skeletons. He found, in fact, again, that they had a highly intelligent capacity with a highly developed cranial capacity, and that they actually lived for a period of 250 to 300 years, lifespan, much longer than we do, much longer than modern man. Kind of as though they were part of those earlier peoples that appeared after the fall of man, and eventually the lifespans kind of began to evolve down, but partway through, there were people who were living 250, 300 years. That's what they found out with them. He found also that they lived not the 30,000 years ago that people have thought, but much more recently than that. So some of these things that supposedly are the clinchers, don't believe them. How extensive is the fossil evidence of human evolution? A leading expert, Henry G., chief science writer for Nature magazine, said that the amount of supposed fossil evidence for human evolution for the period between 10 to 5 million years ago, supposedly that period, would fit into a small box. A small box. We're not talking about rooms filled with skeletal remains and so forth. We've got a small box. And that's all we got. That's all we got. Here's what Henry G. said, very candid man. He said the conventional picture of human evolution is, here's his quote, a completely human invention created after the fact, shaped to accord with human prejudices. This is not a Christian magazine. This is one of the world's supposedly top scientific magazines. Honest enough to say that. I mentioned to you about Stephen Jay Gould, the guy of punctuated equilibrium. About 15 years ago, when Sharon and I were living in Manitoba, we had the Winnipeg Free Press, local newspaper. And there was an interesting article. And in that article it said, evolutionist pleads for a new theory of evolution. And it was Stephen Jay Gould, Harvard professor, speaking to a group of evolutionists saying, the evidence we thought that was there for intermediates simply isn't there. You would think that he would say, so I guess we were wrong. But no, what he did was, please go out and find new evidence so we can come up with a new theory of evolution to preserve this. So tell me this. Christians have been told by evolutionists that they're living in mythology and fantasy. Who's living in mythology and fantasy when you bill yourself to be a top scientist and you are not going according to science and what's been found and the evidence, but you're desperately seeking to preserve your philosophy? Let's talk about next. I'm moving along quickly here, but we want to cover this all. Let's talk about Darwinism and irreducible complexity. Darwin's own test is this, I'm quoting him here. If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed, which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. That's an origin of species. In other words, if you're wanting to come to a heart, an organ, and it could not be formed by slight, small, minuscule changes over millions and billions of years, my theory will break down. So let's look at a test of Darwin's test. And it's the concept of irreducible complexity that Dr. Michael Behe, a world-class microbiologist and biochemist and committed Christian, came up with. And it relates to the complexity of living things. And here's what he says. Track with me because I'm going to give you an example of this. He says that a living system, which include an organ or would include us, or any human device for that matter, is irreducibly complex if it has several different components, that all work together to accomplish its function, such that if you removed any one of them, the thing wouldn't work. That could be for a machine or for an organ. Think of the different components of your heart. If you removed one particular component of the heart doesn't work anymore. That's called irreducible complexity. Complexity that you can't reduce by removing a part. All right. Now, I said to you at the start on Monday that I was not going to get technical on this, and I probably have overstated myself. But I'm going to have to come with and bear with me in a little complexity. Can anybody tell me what this is? Wow, you guys are pretty sharp. That's not bad. I start to get into the technical stuff, and you guys are catching it right away. Tell me what the purpose of a mousetrap is. You guys are good. You are tracking with me. Well, a mousetrap is just a simple human device, but it is an example of irreducible complexity. It has a board to attach all the parts to. It has this clasp that will hold what we call the hammer in place so that the mouse can be caught. It has this little hook that the clasp connects to. And it has, sorry to you PETA members, you know PETAs, People for the Equal Treatment of Animals. It has the hammer, which does what? Puts the mouse into mouse heaven. This is irreducible complexity because if you remove any one of these components, you no longer have a mousetrap. Simplest device. So we come out with this. Say, okay, here, I got this, guys. What is this? Is that a mousetrap? It's a piece of board. Here's what Mr. Natural Selection does when natural selection and evolution, if it would produce a mousetrap, would come along with a piece of board. Mr. Natural Selection will say, so evolution, what is this? That's a mousetrap. You got to be joking. That's a piece of board. What does it do? Well, it catches mice. Well, actually, it doesn't catch mice, but if it's connected to a number of other devices, it will connect mice. Mr. Natural Selection says, it's not a working system. You're toast. So, evolution works hard again and says, got something else for you. What's this? Well, it's a mousetrap. Well, not really a mousetrap, but it's the hammer that would kill the mice. How can this kill the mice? Well, it can't, but if it's connected to a board and a clasp and a hook, it will. Mr. Natural Selection says, this isn't a working system. It doesn't kill or collect anything. There it goes. It's rejected because it's not a working system. You get the picture. Evolution comes up with the clasp. Because evolution can't, by Darwin's own theory, produce all these pieces at the same time. Darwin says it's impossible. You've got to start with one of these, or a part of one of these, and eventually when other pieces come together and they somehow fortuitously hook up together, down the way, you have a mousetrap. Mousetrap's an example of irreducible complexity. Probably the most simple device that could be made. Now, how does this connect to things like even the simplest cell? The simplest cell of the simplest creature, a bacterium, is the most simple cell on Earth. This simple cell is irreducibly complex. It has so many components in it, even in the simple bacterium has over 1 million components in it that all have to connect together and work together at the same time or the thing doesn't work. That can't happen by evolution. Darwin tells us it can't. Can't get 1 million pieces suddenly appearing. And if you don't have the 1 million pieces working together, you don't have a cell. And Mr. Natural Selection does the same thing to it as it did to the components of a hoped-for mousetrap. Now let's come to something far more complex, the human eye. Much more impossible to create by evolution. It has complex interdependent parts. Do you know it has over 100 million light-sensitive cells in it and 1 million nerve fibers to connect to the brain? Evolution can't work suddenly to produce all these or even a handful of these. Here's some of the structures of the eye. The sclera, the white of the eye, protects the eyeball. The pupil is the hole through which light comes. The cornea is something that covers the iris and the pupil to protect it. The iris is the colored part that controls the amount of light. The lens focuses the light on the retina, and the retina detects the light and turns it into electrical impulses. They all have to be there working at the same time, or you don't get vision, you don't have an eye. It's impossible for this to happen. Darwin himself was disturbed by the human eye, and here's what he says. To say that the eye could have been formed in a few steps is absurd in the highest possible degree. Irreducible complexity now answers Darwin's test. He himself actually has answered it by saying it's absurd to say that the eye could have been formed by evolution. And he says if it can be demonstrated that any organ exists that couldn't be formed by numerous slight modifications, my theory absolutely breaks down. And yet worldwide, in institutions of higher learning, people still hold on to his theory, but it's been discredited by his own words. Let's turn next to the evidence of microbiology, the amazing cell. There is a principle of science called the law of biogenesis, which simply means this: life comes from life. Furthermore, biogenesis says that the offspring of the parents will be the same nature and type as the parents. Does that sound at all like Genesis 1? Everything produced according to its own kind? That's what the law of biogenesis says. But naturalists, not to be thwarted by facts or evidence or truth, came up with the law of abiogenesis and said, no, but you can get life from non-life. Contradicts this fundamental principle of science. But here's what they do, because when they're challenged to say, but everywhere we see in every evidence, it's only life from life. That's what the law of biogenesis says. So how do you guys come up with this law of abiogenesis, or theory rather? And they say, well, it only happened once. Right at the very beginning, life came from non-life, and after that, it's all life from life. Now, they don't tell us how it could have happened or give us evidence, but because they're committed to their worldview, they just throw it out and say, well, it happened once. The cell, as I said, is the simplest unit of life in organisms, our individual cells. It contains 1 trillion subatomic parts, and we have 60 trillion human cells in our body. And every one of the parts in every one of these cells interacts with each other with specialized roles that are required for the cell to exist. The cell, in fact, is the most complex machine in the universe. This is not me speaking. These are scientists speaking. So let me show you God's catch-22. We're looking at page 49. Life has 3 key molecules: DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. DNA contains the master plans or blueprint for the cell structure to create proteins. One strand of DNA, which is very small because it's contained within our cell, contains information equivalent to 1,000 books of 1,000 pages each. So DNA is the first key molecule. RNA is the next one, ribonucleic acid. It transports this blueprint from DNA for protein assembly. Much like somebody would take the blueprint for a house and deliver it to the builder and say, here's the blueprint for the house. And then the third key molecule are proteins, and they make up all the cell components and structure of our body. And every one of those 3 key proteins are completely interdependent for life to exist. So now here's God's catch-22. The DNA, as I mentioned, has the blueprint to create the cell machinery, because the cell has to have these little machines in it for it to work. So unless you have the blueprint, you can't get the machinery. Just like unless you have the blueprint for the house, you can't get the house. The blueprint is not the house. But it's the cell machinery that picks up the blueprint and puts it and reads it and puts it into effect. So without the cell machinery, the blueprint doesn't work. But then how does the DNA get in place itself? How does DNA get established in the body? The cell machinery is what makes the DNA. So you can't get the cell machinery unless you have the blueprint, but you can't have the blueprint, the DNA, unless you have the cell machinery. But Darwin's theory says that these things cannot exist at the same time. You require 75 different proteins to carry this blueprint, to make the proteins. But those proteins that are required to carry the blueprint are made by the same process that they are used in to carry the blueprint and make the structures. So which came first, the chicken or the egg? It's that classic conundrum, because they couldn't all separately evolve at the same time. And wow, guys, we all evolved at the same time? Look at that, we're all together and we connect up and do it. Impossible according to Darwinism, but not impossible according to creation. They are all required to be the DNA, the RNA, and the proteins there at the same time for life to work. And there's only one thing that ever explains how that can be, and that is called creation. Also, in the cells, there are complex machines that process food and oxygen for the cell to survive. So you can have all these machines working, but if you don't have food and oxygen to start off with, the cell can't survive. So you have to have the food and oxygen to start off with, and then you get these little machines that make more food and oxygen. Same thing, chicken or egg. They're all having to be there together at the same time at the beginning as a fully functioning unit. Here's an analogy that a guy that we heard of from physics yesterday came up with, Sir Fred Hoyle. He said that the probability that life came through random processes, think evolution, natural selection, mutation, is equivalent to believing that a tornado striking a junkyard would reassemble the trash and leave a completed, assembled, and functioning Boeing 747 there. Let me give you a further interesting and excellent analogy. This is from Dr. Michael Behe. We talked about him. He's the man who came up with the concept of irreducible complexity, which evolutionists have never been able to refute. Here's what Dr. Behe says. The probability of linking together just 100 amino acids to create one protein molecule by chance would be the same as a blindfolded man finding one marked grain of sand somewhere in the vastness of the Sahara Desert and doing it not just once, but 3 different times. And that guy's a top biochemist. Let's look next at life and language, information in the cell, page 50. What is very interesting is that 20th century biology has said that it is clear now that all life develops and functions from what are called coded language structures. That is, that in the cell there are language structures that are in the form of codes that carry information. And these things allow all the parts of the cells to communicate with each other. So here's what DNA does. It stores information by what's called nucleotides, which is a pattern of, and this is the words of scientists, chemical letters. In our cells are what are described as chemical letters, ATCG, adenine, thymine, cytosine, guanine. And they have coded information, and here's how it's produced. 3 of those combinations alone forms what they call words with these chemical letters. And now it has information that's in the cell. Now, we have DNA molecules. If you put many DNA molecules together, you get genes. If you have many genes together, you have chromosomes, and this gives us our heredity, our characteristics. Your genome, your complete set of genes in your body is over 3 billion characters long, and they have to be in the exact right order for you to survive. How's that for chance? So here's what these gene codes do. They give instructions to the cells to make amino acids, and then amino acids make proteins, and proteins make our cell structures. DNA, and this is really important to know, DNA is like the paper and ink of a book. You can have the structures of a book with paper and ink, but you don't have a book if you just get random ink marks that somebody spills in the book. There has to be information, intelligible information that can be read and can be used. And we know that books come from prior intelligence. They come from an author. Well, the information and codes in the DNA, these letters, are even more so that, because they're more sophisticated by far than any book, except the Bible. They come from a prior intelligent source. They are not just chemicals. There is a prior source that puts the codes on the chemicals to make you and me and everyone else. But listen to this again. They're described as letters that form words in the cell. What does that sound like? In the beginning was the Word, and when God created, He spoke words. He said, "Let there be light. Let there be this." Our whole existence has come from words, and now scientists find that there are word structures in every cell of our body. How about that for confirming the scriptures? So here's a key. For this code that's in the cells to make these proteins, which we're made of, there has to be a code sender and a code receiver. And the cell, the sender and the receiver, have to agree in advance about the meaning of the code for it to work. So they've got to say, "Oh yeah, okay, what's your code? Oh yeah, okay, I see your code. I recognize that code. That works." We start to make proteins. Darwin's chance mutations can't work to make genetic improvements. Why? Because what they do is they damage the code. They don't improve the code. They make a change to the code, and then the sender says, "Well, I'm sending you this," and the receiver says, "I don't recognize that. What the heck is that?" It would be like a house builder getting building plans, a blueprint, and finding that he's got a blueprint for a part house and part boat because it's been wrecked. Let's talk about, for a moment, so I'm going to go on to this because I've given you this indication that mutation cannot make these positive changes. It's damaging. In fact, somebody once said, you know, it would be like taking, well, I'll tell you this in a moment. Problem with mutants. You can think of X-Men, page 51. Again, mutations are errors in the copying of DNA. They are mistakes. What happens is letters in this DNA code through mutation are lost, changed in a damaging way, or added in a damaging way. Evolutionists say, well, no, but these errors can create new genetic information. Natural selection will do this. That's how we get Wolverine and Charles Xavier and everybody else. But the problem is, again, is that mutations cause loss of information, not added information, and loss of functional capacity. It's like this. You get a child on a computer program, get on a computer, he's in a computer program, and he starts to go over all the keys and make, you know, random little things because he doesn't know what he's doing. Does that improve the computer program? No, it wrecks it. It's the exact parallel in the analogy. Richard Dawkins was once asked, give examples of mutation that causes changes in organisms by adding new positive information. He could not give one example. Let me go on to something else that's not in your notes, but it's pretty exciting stuff. There is something called epigenetics. We've already shown, I think you're convinced, that it's impossible for evolution to cause life to exist and to cause positive changes in life. Evolutionists say, but a mutation in the DNA could do this and create new life forms. We know that's not the case. But let's say for the moment, for the sake of argument, giving the devil his due, saying, okay, let's pretend that actually that could happen. The problem is they found now that DNA alone is not sufficient to build life and cause life forms. They found something called epigenetics. DNA is genetic information. Epigenetics means above genetics, separate from genetics. Life requires epigenetic information in addition to genetic information. It's information, again, codes, but not in the DNA. And what they find is that this epigenetic source of information cannot be changed by mutation. It's not possible. This epigenetic information is right in the structure of the embryonic cells, which is the earliest cells in us when we, when we have an embryo that's started. And this information is needed for creating everything that's in us: proteins, cells, tissues, organs, bodies. Here's what it does. Epigenetics and epigenetic information contains mechanisms to turn off or on the genes that are in our genome. So what we have, each one of us, remember we've got that 3 billion of them, we have a huge number of genes. You and I will have genes for all kinds of things that we have not become. Epigenetics goes among those list of genes and says, no, not blonde hair, turn that off, black hair. Blue eyes, not brown eyes, we turn brown eyes off. Short, not tall, we turn tall off. It goes through and it selects. It's not just DNA that does this. We become this through the process of epigenetics being involved along with genetics to make you and me the unique people that we are. And again, it cannot be changed by mutation. Any significant effect on epigenetics will cause the death of the organism. So let's come back to, for a moment, a summary, because we've been talking about the origins of life and microbiology, and how does evolution stack up against the evidence? We found that it fails the laws of thermodynamics. We found it fails the evidence of the fossil record. We found that it is repudiated by the Cambrian explosion. We found that the 4 sacred cows of Darwinism are dead oxes. We found that the dinosaur missing links were simply false. There's never been a missing link, and the same for human evolution. We found that it fails the test of irreducible complexity. It fails Darwin's own words. We found that it fails and is contrary to the evidence of the complexity in the human cell that make it impossible for evolution to create it, or any cell. It fails this chemical information, this alphabet of letters, these words in the DNA. It fails the evidence that mutation cannot create positive effects, and it fails epigenetics. How does evolution stack up against the evidence? It completely fails it. But today, Darwinism is still taught in the public schools. It's still taught in the colleges, it's still taught in the universities, and you will find few, if any of them, that will actually teach the things that I've been talking to you about today. They include Java Man, Haeckel's embryos. They don't include intelligent design. Let's listen to what C.S. Lewis said about evolution. I grew up believing that this evolution, this myth, evolution, believing in this myth, and I have felt, I still feel, its almost perfect grandeur. Let no one say we are an unimaginative age. Neither the Greeks nor the Norsemen ever invented a better story. But the myth asks me to believe that reason, human reason, is simply the unforeseen and unintended byproduct of a mindless process at one stage of its endless and aimless becoming. The content of the myth thus knocks from under me the only ground on which I could possibly believe the myth to be true. If my own mind is a product of the irrational, how shall I trust my mind when it tells me about evolution? Here's some conclusions from world-class scientists. Number one, this is on page 52. We have not the slightest chance of a chemical evolutionary origin for even the simplest of cells. This comes from a man with huge honesty and integrity. It comes from Dean Kenyon, a biochemist, former evolutionist, and co-author of the evolutionary textbook, Biochemical Predestination, in which he sets out that evolution was true. He was repudiating his own book. That's integrity. That's science. That's somebody operating in truth. Page 53. An honest man armed with all the knowledge available to us now could only state that in some sense the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. So many are the conditions which would have had to have been satisfied to get it going. Francis Crick, biochemist, co-Nobel Prize winner for discovering the structure of DNA. Not a believer. And then we'll leave with this from Albert Einstein. Page 53, we are in the position of a little child entering a huge library filled with books in many different languages. The child knows someone must have written these books. It does not know how. It does not understand the languages in which they are written. The child dimly suspects a mysterious order in the arrangement of the books, but doesn't know what it is. That, it seems to me, is the attitude of even the most intelligent being toward God. We see a universe marvelously arranged and obeying certain laws, but only dimly understand those laws. Our limited minds cannot grasp the mysterious force that moves the constellations. I'm going to ask you to take a look at Lesson 9, the days of Genesis. It shows that the word day in Genesis 1 and 2 in particular can only refer to a 24-hour day. Now, as we conclude, I want to have played for you a song that is a marvelous song, in my opinion, and it demonstrates all that I've been talking about in the last 3 days. Take a listen to it, called So Will I. Okay, if someone can grab the lights there, we'll finish that last chapter. All right, I'll give you a couple of options. We can go through the last chapter, or I can open it up to some questions if you like. What's your pref? Who would prefer questions?
Last chapter.
Last chapter, all right. The days of Genesis. Remember we talked about some theories earlier where people said, well, you know, we believe that there's a God out there that created, but we think that it happened over billions of years because the word day in Genesis is just sort of a literary device. It doesn't really mean a 24-hour day. It's just talking about, you know, some some period of time that indicates that God created. So the days of Genesis, particularly Genesis 1 and 2, are these literal 24-hour days? Well, the word for day in the Hebrew, the main word is yom. Yom means one of three things, either a 24-hour day. It also can mean the daylight part of the day, that is... All right, let's listen to the song.